Hi there, everyone. I'm excited to have the opportunity to present to you a project that I've worked on over the past year concerning Indigenous language revitalization and preservation for Syllabics-using Indigenous communities in Canada, which was to prepare Unicode proposals to revise the digital text standards for technical issues that some of these communities were experiencing, either in the representation of their characters, the correct representation of their characters, or in adding new characters to the Unicode Standard that these communities were missing. This project was part of a larger project concerning the syllabics that I've been working on with Typotheque for the past year. And what we've been doing is, in our mission for this project was to comprehensively research the typographic preferences at the local level for individual communities, to understand what their needs and preferences were for the syllabics, as well as to understand and document any technical issues or barriers that they were experiencing that we could find technical solutions for. In a lot of cases, many of the communities outside of the Eastern Inuktitut dialect communities, as well as the Cree communities in Canada and Ojibwe communities, they have very good representation in the Unicode Standard. However, many of the Dene communities that are in the western part of Canada, as well as the Western Inuktitut dialect, Natchilingmiutut, do not have as comprehensive technical support at this text standard level, or even representative support within the Unicode Standard and in currently available typefaces. So what we did was we reached out and made and built relationships with local language keepers in these Indigenous communities, and we asked them and listened to them and allowed them to explain what their problems were. Technically speaking, representatively speaking, we noted all of these issues, and then we went to try to find technical solutions to help them. And something that became very apparent was that there was a need, for instance, in the Natchilingmiutut dialect of Western Inuktitut, there was a need for adding 12 syllabic characters that their orthography was simply missing from Unicode, so they couldn't actually write their language properly on digital platforms. And as well as the Dakoth community in central British Columbia, in the middle of the Rocky Mountains, they were lacking the accurate representation of their syllabic characters in the Unicode code charts, which had a ripple effect of giving them system-level fonts that did not have the correct representation. And I'll explain a little bit more how that becomes a big barrier in daily use. Why this is really important to research the local typographic preferences and research technical barriers that these communities are experiencing is because these communities are fighting very hard right now to just revitalize and preserve and hold on to their languages, because language is central to their culture and retaining their cultural knowledge and traditions. So if they lack technical support at the text standards level, they're not able to transmit their language in a written way and to document it for future generations, or even to allow current generations to engage in the process of learning and relearning their language and culture. So being able to work in this way, we're providing language tools and going right to this text standard level so that we can provide a framework for developing comprehensive new typefaces, or even just developing a glyph set for these new typefaces. Because often when we engage in typeface design for more comprehensively supported scripts like Latin, Greek, Cyrillic, when we engage in typeface design for scripts such as these, we can just open up our font design application and start. We have a design concept and we have parameters for a project, and we can just start executing. We don't have to think about, do I have the technical means to even prepare a font for this community? We just work. But with these communities, or font design for these communities, that doesn't exist. In fact, there is no font app that has a syllabics glyph set. So we have to define that glyph set first, And part of that means that we have to do this text standard work as well in order to define what that glyph set should be, and then we start designing after community outreach. So really quickly, I'm going to give you a crash course in syllabics typography in terms and conventions, because it will help with what I'm explaining later in the talk. So something inherent to syllabics typography is this concept of rotation. So rotation meaning that a syllabic form, a syllabic character, so a given character that you see in front of you here, will have potentially 4 different rotation positions or axes positions that it can rotate across. So in syllabics typography, many users think about it as either north-west or northeast-southwest, or they would refer to it in particular, the indigenous peoples will often refer to it as the grandfather or grandmother direction. And so what these positions represent is the positions themselves, the orientation rotations, represent a vowel or an inflection of a vowel. So on the top line, you'll see a closed triangular shape. You can think of it like a delta that's rotated across 4 axes, and it will represent a pure vowel in a given series. So e or e, o, a. Then in the subsequent lines below, line 2, 3, 4, you'll see that what these syllabic characters represent is that as a base, they represent a pure consonant, and the orientation of that base syllabic across the 4 rotation positions it can take will represent the inflection of the vowel. So, for instance, in line 2, ne, ni, no, na, ta, ti, to, ta. In syllabics typography, if you're familiar with looking at it, you'll have noticed that there are shrunken or smaller marks that are sometimes small versions of the larger syllabic, full-size syllabic, which is what you see in front of you here in this word, but they can also be abstracted or accented marks that are distinct from the full-size syllabic characters, and they represent a pure consonant, which is also necessary in Indigenous languages across across Canada and the United States. So, for instance, what we have in syllabics typography is this convention of a series. So we have, for instance, ke, ki, ko, ka, and then the shrunken version of ka represents the pure consonant k. Something that's also important to note in syllabics typography is the importance of having a much wider space, word space, in order to keep syllabics, which have a very wide horizontal stance on a line, in order to keep them legible and to keep the word images distinct, you have to have a much wider word character than Latin, for example. Something also inherently important, which will relate to what I'll talk about in the second half of the presentation, is the difference between these 2 inherent styles. The square form style, which derived in the western part of Canada primarily for the Dene and the western Cree language communities, as well as Blackfoot in their historical use of syllabics, and the round form style, which the round form style on the bottom that you see is the very common form of syllabics that you're probably familiar with seeing if you've seen this writing system. It's the style, that's the typographic style preference that Inuktitut has, which is a big reason why the Unicode code charts have used it, because Inuktitut is implemented at an administrative level, unlike the other language communities. Ojibwe and Cree communities also use the round form style, and these 3 compose the largest speaking groups. However, the Dene communities distinctly prefer to use this style, which you could think of it like a unicase style, although there's no case in syllabics in the writing system. You could think of it as a uni-height style, as opposed to variation in height. Okay. The first proposal that I worked on came from identifying 12 syllabic characters that were missing from the Unified Canadian Aboriginal Syllabics Unicode Standard, Unicode set for the Natchalingmutut dialect of Inuktitut. Now, Natchalingmutut, in the context of Inuktitut dialects in Nunavut and Nunavik is quite remote, and it's quite distinct as well. It has distinct sounds that any of the other dialects, even these Western Inuktitut dialects, do not contain. And part of the reason why Natchalingmiutut did not have these syllabics that it required in the text standard was because of its remoteness. If I want to fly, so I'm based in Toronto, that's where I'm speaking to you from right now, or if I was in Montreal and I wanted to fly to Nunavut, first of all, I have to fly into any of these communities. Even if I'm in Iqaluit, I have to fly to any of the other communities. But I can't just take a flight and connect into Iqaluit. What I have to do is I'd have to fly over to Yellowknife or to Edmonton, and then I'd have to connect up into this region that way. So there's no direct flight, really, for most regions. There's a hub of Yellowknife or Edmonton, and then you connect into the region. Now, this remoteness led to when there was a standardization effort in the 1970s by the Inuit Cultural Institute, which was based in Iqaluit. They missed identifying these sounds, these 12 sounds that were required for Natchalingmiutut. And what ended up happening was that standard, which was used as the authority to prepare the Unicode Standard to represent Inuktitut and all the dialects, missed those 12 sounds. So here you can see a breakdown of the language dialects. So as I was conducting the initial research on the Inuktitut syllabics as part of this larger syllabics project with Typotheque, I was on the Wikipedia page for Inuktitut, which I will say, I know that we tend to be very skeptical of Wikipedia as a source, but when it comes to syllabics, there's actually a lot of it's actually a good repository of information for syllabics, and it tells you a lot about support and representation because it relies on Unicode. So when I was looking at this comprehensive chart, which was to represent all of the dialects of Inuktitut in Nunavut, including Natchalingmiutut, and in Nunavik, I noticed here, I said, oh, this is a huge red flag. Why are there empty boxes for this series? And then why is there this weird thing going on here where you've got a S series, character with an acute accent beside it, or a grave accent baseline shifted down to the baseline? And in reading the footnotes, I noticed these are found in Natchalingmiutut, but not yet in Unicode. So they're showing here an image, but this is not yet in Unicode. So I said, okay, there's a technical issue that this community's must be experiencing. So what I did was I went and did some digging and tried to find out more, and I came across this article from 2011 of the teacher Nilaulak, who developed these syllabic characters with the firm Hadlari Consulting. They developed these syllabics characters for use in the community, and they developed font tools in working in conjunction with Tiro Typeworks, which gave them a localized font, but they didn't have Unicode code points. They were using private use area code points, which did work quite well for their needs on a local position, but it didn't give them a reliable way to store their text in a digital database, or to use their text, to use their language in email correspondence, in daily uses. So when I saw this article, I got in touch with the Nunavut-wide Language Center, Piravik, and they forwarded my email to Tamalik. Tamalik is a local or a native speaker of Natchalingmiutut, but she's also an expert in translation for all of the dialects of Nunavut. And Nilaulak was her mentor growing up and in learning to be a translator. So my email was forwarded to Tamalik, and she put me in touch with Nilaulak, who does not speak English or French. She only speaks Natchalingmiutut. So I had to work with Nilaulak and Tamalik, with Tamalik translating and relaying the information. And from there, Tamalik also connected me with Ilhapi and Atima Hadlari, who run Hadlari Consulting. And they were responsible for working with both Nilaulak, as I explained, and Tiro Typeworks to take Nilaulak's characters that she developed to represent these syllabics, or to represent these sounds, and then to develop tools, a keyboard and a font that they could use locally for the communities. So these are the 12 syllabic characters that were missing that we needed to propose. And so what we did is I began working very closely with Tamalik and Ilhapi and Atima and Ilalak in order to gather attestations. So here you see a list of the Nunavut, the typical text syllabic standard, or the standardized syllabic set for Nunavut, and you see that it's missing these 12 syllabic characters. For Natural-Lingmutu, this is their local chart. It includes these characters, which you can see here. These missing characters right here on the sh line and the h line. So the localized keyboard and font that was developed by Tiro provided a really great foundation, not only for giving the community something to use, but it also gave the community something to build materials with that they could develop attestations for. So this is Tamalik showing me a document here where she's using the localized tool. She experienced a lot of issues when she was working, for instance, on this large book, which was for a play of a traditional Naturalik traditional story, where she had a very hard time working with this tool because sending it back and forth to the typesetter caused a lot of issues because of the lack of a Unicode representation for these characters. So what we did was we gathered examples of handwriting, and we gathered letters from Tamalik and other authorities in the community, as well as gathering examples of the characters in use. So the dictionary for the Inuktitut region, also including Natural-Lingmutu. And these are educational materials showing the characters in use. And we prepared our proposal to the Unicode Standard, and it was accepted on the 6th of October 2020. And that was a huge step. What it meant is that now, as of September 14th, 2020, the characters will be available in the Unicode Standard. However, that work is not the full work. We also have to continue working to get system-level revisions to the fonts that are available on the Mac OS, on Windows, as well as Android, as well as keyboard solutions that support. So we ended up with a UCAS Extended A encoding. So this is a sort of a roadmap to explain that you begin with community outreach, you create a proposal, you get your proposal accepted, that's great. However, your work's far from done. You have to then communicate with the font vendors, so Mac, Windows, Google for Android, develop keyboards, and then you try to prepare everything for the release of the Unicode Standard, but often these two don't align. Okay, now the second effort that I'm going to move a bit quicker through was to develop a proposal that would correct the representative glyphs which were not correctly represented for the Dacath or carrier syllabics. These communities that use syllabics, they're the only Indigenous community in British Columbia that use syllabics, and they have a use of syllabics that goes back to the 1880s. And the language keepers that I worked with, Dennis Cumberland and Francois Prince, these are the key language keepers in the community who are trying to revive the use of their syllabics. So this was a carrier syllabics newspaper, this one particularly printed in 1891, which shows the accurate representation of the characters, as well as a grammar, or a book, printed as well as in the 1890s. Carved tombstones showing the correct use of the syllabics, as well as handwritten documents. And this is what was really the big problem going on. Because the Unicode Standard in 1999 published the chart with characters such as this, you can see the difference here between these, the issue that was being faced was that these did not look like Dacath's or carrier syllabics, and it didn't read properly for the community. So there actually was a big barrier in readability, as well as the community prefers their final characters to be centered on from the top line to the base line, because their characters are following the square form style, they're unicase in height. This was the original one of the older Unicode code charts that was published that shows this issue. And you can see these issues, or you can see that at some point with the UCAS standard, there was an attempt to try to disunify carrier syllabics from the rest. There's no reason why these carrier-specific characters couldn't have been represented with these marks, but they obviously saw at some stage that there was a need for this, and so they provided that representation. There was also an issue with the correct orientation. You can see even in these historical documents, this document, an earlier document showing the syllabics chart with the orientation of this tlo character, and a later publication in the early 20th century that shows the character represented in the incorrect orientation. This is the correct orientation that the local language keepers Francois and Dennis confirmed that this character should take. So we went to revise that because the UCAS charts use this orientation, which would read incorrectly. It would inflect the wrong sound, vowel, syllable combination. So what we did was we proposed revisions to the character proportions, so you can see the difference here, revising them to be a full height or a square form position, which was critically important, as well as revising the orientation and proportion, and revising the vertical positioning of these finals characters. So this proposal was accepted in late July at UTC 168, and what it means is that these character revisions will be published in the code charts in Unicode version 15 in September 2020. So this is a big step for this community because it means that when they write an email, once they have a system level typeface that implements the correct character representations that are shown in the code charts, and Apple, Microsoft, and Android are able to then push those changes through in a new version, which can take some time. That means that these communities will be able to engage at a much deeper level with their language preservation and revitalization efforts, because they can use these characters in text messaging, email, and everyday uses in a reliable way where their language can be read accurately. So in preparing this proposal, we looked at these materials in order to present how the community is using them today, and pointing out the correct finals positioning, and then the final it was quite a comprehensive change to the carrier syllabics. Okay, thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and I hope that I was able to shed some light on a process of going to the text standard level and how typeface design can have a social impact on Indigenous or have a social impact on Indigenous language revitalization and preservation, but also just how typeface design can have a social impact in general by engaging with local users and trying to understand what their needs and preferences are. Thank you very much.